All right, we are live. So, welcome to another Classic Comics live stream. So, last week I had attempted to talk about the recent book, Slaying the Dragon by author Ben Riggs. Now, this book is about the history of TSR and why it eventually went bankrupt and wound up being bought by Wizards of the Coast. I had really just begun talking about it when I started having technical trouble in my previous live stream last week. So I really didn't get to it the way I would have liked. And so I'm going to talk about that now. So I think where I left off in the previous live stream, and first I want to thank everyone for stopping by for this live stream, including those who will watch or listen on the rewatch later. Thank you. So TSR was started by Gary Gygax, the guy who more or less invented Dungeons and Dragons along with Dave Arneson. But he didn't really have the money to start a company. And so he wound up going into business with a couple of other people who contributed startup money for the company. Now, one of these was his friend, Don Kay. Don Kay and Gary Gygax had been friends since childhood. So they knew each other very well. Now, there was another guy named Brian Bloom. And Brian Bloom was more a friend of Don Kay. I don't think Gygax really knew him that well initially. But Brian Bloom, his father was a successful businessman, and Brian Bloom was able to get some money from his father to help out. So these three guys put their money together. And Don Kay, he had a life insurance policy, and he actually took out a loan on his life insurance policy to help generate money for the company and got TSR up and running. Now, this was in the very early days, and at this point, TSR was basically being run out of Gary Gygax's basement, and they were pretty much just doing the original rules for D&D, the original little collection of booklets. And it was mainly sold by mail order, and I think they would go to wargaming conventions and also sell it as well, but that was about it, and maybe a few hobby shops. Now, sadly, pretty early into this, Don Kay had a heart attack and died suddenly. And this also created an awkward situation. His wife inherited his shares of the company. The wife, however, had never been a fan of this whole endeavor. She didn't like that her husband had taken out this loan. She didn't like that Gary Gygax very much and didn't like D&D. So after he died, she really didn't want the shares and wanted to sell them. Gary Gygax, unfortunately, didn't have the money to purchase these shares. So these outstanding shares wound up being bought by Brian Bloom's father. And his father would later give those shares to Brian Bloom's brother, Kevin Bloom. So once D&D started to really take off and TSR really started to succeed, it was being run by this trio of people, Gary Gygax and the Bloom brothers. Now, oh, hey, Adega. Thank you for stopping by. So I don't know if you weren't here earlier, so I'm going to talk about the history of TSR and just talk about how they wound up going bankrupt, really, because I've read a book recently that kind of details this information. So it's being run by these three men. Now, on paper, they were supposed to be, they each had equal say in how things were run, and they made decisions based on it had to be unanimous. That was technically how it was supposed to work. In reality, it seems more likely that it was more or less the Blooms really running things, because when there were decisions to be made, invariably the two Bloom brothers would sort of ally with each other against Gary. So they tended, for all practical purposes, to really be running things. And they made most of the decisions. Now, in those early days in particular, the people that got hired at TSR, there was a lot of nepotism going on, and a lot of the employees were either friends or relatives of Gary or friends or relatives of the Bloom brothers. And as they asserted more and more control of the company, the Bloom brothers began basically kicking Gary's friends and relatives out of the company. And because they were in control, Gary couldn't really do anything about it, which was frustrating for him. And let me see what next here. Okay, yeah. So Dave Arneson. Now, one thing I want to talk about, of course, is Gary Gygax was a co-creator of D&D. The other person who had a hand in creating D&D was a guy named Dave Arneson. Now, I talked about him and how he and Gygax met and how they collaborated on creating D&D in my previous live stream last week. So I'd refer you to that. Basically, once D&D got going and was selling well, Dave Arneson was brought onto the company for a short time, but he didn't really produce much while he was there, and eventually he was shown the door. I assume maybe because he just wasn't really producing anything for the company. But he eventually went to court and was able to sue to get some royalties on sale of D&D, because at that point he wasn't getting anything. And it was agreed upon by the court that he should get about 2.5% of sales on Dungeons and Dragons. And this is what led to the creation of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Basically, Gary Gygax created AD&D as a way to get out from under paying royalties to Arneson, because his argument was, well, I created AD&D myself. Arneson had nothing to do with it. Therefore, he should not get royalties. Unfortunately, the courts did not see it that way because Arneson took him to court, of course, and they ruled that he should get royalties on that as well. I wanted to point that out. Now, because he really was just kind of kneecapped at the company and really couldn't do a lot, somewhere around the beginning of the 80s, Gary Gygax left TSR's headquarters in Wisconsin and he went out to Hollywood to start working on creating properties in Hollywood that were for D&D. And of course, from that, we got the D&D cartoon eventually. However, before he left, this is in 79. TSR was contacted by a person named Mildred Marmer. Now, Mildred Marmer was a vice president at Random House Publishing. It turns out that her kids were D&D fans. They really liked it. And I guess seeing how much her kids and their friends like D&D, she realized that D&D could potentially be a moneymaker for Random House. So she contacted TSR and wanted to make a distribution deal. Now, at this point, TSR, and again, this is in 79, TSR was mainly in hobby shops. And again, as selling it like gaming conventions and stuff. And they were making money. They were successful, but it was, they hadn't gone like the company hadn't really started soaring yet. Now, through Random House, which was one of the biggest publishers in America and therefore in the world, Random House could put their gaming material directly into bookstores. In particular, this is the again late 70s, early 80s, and shopping malls were everywhere in America. And every shopping mall in America had a Walden Books or a B. Dalton bookseller or both. And through Random House, they could put D&D material into every one of those places, which would massively expand their reach and expand their audience. And they wound up striking a deal. And beginning on January 1st, 1980, Random House became the primary publisher for Dungeons and Dragons. And of course, as a result of this, in 1980, sales of D&D began to skyrocket, and D&D began to enter the mainstream culture in many ways. And D&D sales would be absolutely through the roof. In 1980 and 81, TSR was practically printing money. And there were a number of reasons for this. Part of this also, of course, was because of the deal with Random House, but there was another factor. And this is something that has been talked about a lot in the history of D&D and role-playing games, and that is the Satanic Panic, which was taking place around this time in late 70s, early 80s in America. And so because of the kind of occult elements you would see in some of the artwork in D&D products, D&D was seen as basically being a kind of demonic influence or satanic influence by some people, particularly very religious people. And you had priests saying that it would corrupt your soul or that sort of thing. And, you know, religious people, they get a lot of heat for all the criticism they heaped on the game. And I think it's some of that is certainly fair because it was certainly a real thing that happened. And I remember at the time thinking it was a bit ridiculous, playing D&D myself. But another thing I don't think that people really take into account is how much basically crackpots uh, psychologists played a role in this. Like I remember watching an episode of Donahue, which was a popular talk show at the time, and there was this psychologist on it talking on at length about how D&D basically caused people to lose grip on reality. Basically, the argument from this guy and some other shrinks was that D&D would drive your kids crazy. It would basically make them delusional, and through that, their inability to distinguish reality from fantasy, they might become dangerous and maybe hurt or even kill somebody, which I mean is just as ridiculous. And I think in some ways that was actually more damaging because, you know the religious fervor stuff, I think most people would dismiss that as just that religious fervor and kind of overblown. But when you've got, these quote unquote secular experts talking, and they're saying similar things. They're just really wording it differently, but it's kind of the same kind of stuff. I think that may have actually done more damage to TSR or to D&D than the religious argument did. But in any case, like one thing that really set this off was there was a young man named James Egbert III, and he was involved in a very high profile missing persons case that became a murder case. And this became kind of a very sensationalized story. And this was the, this murder of this kid, and I say murder in quotes, was really probably where a lot of people in America first heard the term Dungeons and Dragons. And that right from the start gave it kind of this bad reputation. And as a result, D&D would be blamed for deaths, for suicides, and various other things. And the media, instead of trying to get to the facts, really just fed into the panic and promoted it, really. And I'm not going to talk about that too much because there's a video I've been meaning to do for a long time about that. And so I'm going to kind of skip over that for now. But the thing is that although it gave D&D a bad reputation, in a way it also fueled sales because, what's the best way to get kids to buy something? To tell them that they shouldn't have it, or to tell them to stay away from it. And as a result, that actually it made the game in some ways more popular with kids because kids want to know, hey, what is this? What's going on? What's the story? Adega, yeah, you remember that? Yeah, yeah, I certainly remember it too. So anyway, getting back to the company. So Gygax and Bloom had a contentious relationship, as I said. And uh, but despite that, from 1979 to 1982, the company was growing like crazy. And as a result of this, they hired lots and like hundreds of new staff members to help meet this demand because they just kept assuming that the demand was going to keep going. The problem was in 83, sales kind of leveled off. And then after that, in 84, sales just dropped off a cliff. And as a result of that, in like around 84, 85, they had a lot of firings, a lot of layoffs. They laid off like 2/3 of the company or something like that. It was pretty bad. Um, by 1985, their sales on their rule books and their box sets had dropped about 70%. I mean, it was really bad. It was financially devastating for the company. And the company was having financial issues to begin with because of other reasons. A lot of this was just down to poor management. Gary Gygax and the Bloom brothers, none of them had any formal business training. In fact, Gary Gygax, I think he never even graduated from high school. Actually, I don't think. I might be wrong on that. I'd have to recheck, but I think that was the case. So none of them had, business degrees or any real formal business training or any experience running a business. And so I think there were a lot of just bad decisions that were made. But then there are also some that were just dumb, and it seems to an extent because they got so rich so quick, there was kind of a lot of reckless and irresponsible spending. They blew money on a lot of things they didn't need. Uh, Even though the company wasn't that big and really didn't need them, they bought a whole fleet of automobiles that they owned that most that really weren't even used. At one point, they purchased the magazine Amazing Stories for some reason, even though it had terrible sales. At one point, TSR bought a needlepoint company, which it later turned out was actually owned by a cousin of the Bloom brothers. So they just bought it to help out a relative, not because it made any financial sense. And Gygax, to be fair, wasn't immune to this himself. He's blew a lot of money, particularly when he moved out to LA, which I'll get to that in a minute. But like one thing he did is he bought a castle in Scotland, which I think he actually visited twice in the whole time he had it. And there were just a lot of other bad investments, and this sort of compounded the financial problems that the company had once the sales really just started to tank. Now, as I mentioned earlier, at the beginning of the 80s, Gygax went out to Hollywood. Now, I don't know this for a fact, but I'm guessing a lot of this was prompted by the fact that, he was kind of powerless at TR and probably frustrated. And he had also recently, oh, these stories are taking you back. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I would highly recommend anyone who's a fan of RPGs to read this book. It's by Ben Riggs. It's called Slaying the Dragon. And it was just recently published late this past year. I got it for Christmas and read it over the holidays. And it's just kind of curious timing that I read it around the time that this whole mess with Wizards of the Coast is happening. And I will talk a bit about Wizards of the Coast and about their backtracking on the OGL some if I have time. I want to go to about 8, probably 8, maybe 8:30 at the latest, something like that. So I don't know if I'll have time. We'll see. But Gygax was recently divorced around this time. And my guess is being rich for the first time in his life and being single for the long time in many years, I'm guessing that Hollywood had a lot of allure to him. And so he went out to Hollywood to try and get, D&D films and TV shows made. The only thing of note that we got out of that was the D&D cartoon. He also tried to get comic books and novels going. Not much came to this. Now, while he was in Hollywood, Gary Gygax met a guy by the name of Flint Dill, who was a screenwriter in Hollywood. Uh, he had come to Hollywood and had mainly become a writer doing cartoons. And if you watched any cartoons in the 80s, you probably watched some cartoons that were written by Flint Dill. He wrote episodes of G.I. Joe, Transformers, and some other stuff. I don't remember what else, but he wrote for a lot of cartoons during that period. And he and Gary Gygax kind of at some point became acquainted and kind of became friends. And they tried for years to get a D&D movie going, it didn't happen. I'm sure Flint was probably involved in getting the D&D cartoon going. Probably introducing Gary Gygax to people to help kind of get that rolling. And according to Flint Dill, um, Gary Gygax was like when he was in Hollywood, he was living the life. I mean, it was like cocaine and boob jobs, as far as the eye could see. And he was spending a lot of money. But the party ended around 82 when one day Gygax found out that his bank account had basically been shut down and by the bank. And it's kind of in the book, it's kind of a point of dispute of how much Gary knew about how bad of a shape the company was really in. Because apparently, as Gary told it, he was basically oblivious about all the problems that were happening back with TSR and the layoffs and the bad sales and all that. And the author, Ben Riggs, of course, says this is kind of hard to believe and that he probably knew more than he admitted to later. But in any case, at that point, Gary left and went back to Wisconsin. And when he got back to Wisconsin, found the company to be in a bad shape financially. It was several $1 million in debt at this point. Now, once he got back, or what was it? I'm sorry, no, it was 1.5 million in debt, and sales were still dropping at this point. Now, once he got back, he exercised an option and he purchased 700 shares of TSR's stock. And then he also got the shares that his oldest son, Ernie Gygax, had. Now, with those shares put together, it made him the majority stakeholder and therefore effectively the owner of the company. With that in place, he then, he took control of the company, made himself president and CEO, and more or less cut the Blooms out of really making any decisions. However, the company was still financially in a bad way and they needed money from somewhere. And so Gary approached Flint Dill because Flint Dill's family was wealthy. And why they were wealthy, I'll get to that in just a second because that's an interesting story in and of itself. But he tried to get Flint Dill to invest in the company. Now, Flint Dill declined. And what he did was he introduced Gygax to his sister, whose name was Lorraine. She was Lorraine Williams at that point. Now, so Flint Dill and Lorraine, they were both granddaughters a, of a newspaper tycoon named Dill, and I forget his first name. I think it might have been Edward Dill. I'm not sure, but basically, back in the early 20th century, he was a newspaper tycoon, and he owned a lot of newspapers and magazines, and his family was very wealthy. Now, he's particularly of interest to people in the sci-fi area because Flint Dill wound up purchasing a character from a sci-fi writer that would eventually become Buck Rogers and used Buck Rogers to create a comic strip for his newspapers. And of course, Buck Rogers was really kind of the first sort of swashbuckling sci-fi action hero. And I mean, you could argue that John Carter was first, and he really was, but the readership of those Barsoom novels compared to the readership of Dill's newspapers was huge. So even though John Carter was technically first, Buck Rogers was the first sort of sci-fi hero that most people ever heard of. He had a lot more impact and a lot more influence, I think, than John Carter did. But anyway, so their family was wealthy, and he wanted them to invest money in the company. Now, Lorraine Williams declined to do this. However, part of the reason why Flint Dill had introduced Gary to her is because she had gotten a business degree. She had like an MBA, and she had recently taken control of some hospital that was like really in a mess financially and in debt, and had basically helped them kind of cut costs and turn things around and got it functioning again. So he thought she might be a good choice to come in and help get TSR back in a good place financially. And she accepted, she declined to offer money to keep the company going, but offered to sort of take control of the company as a manager and get it going again. And Gygax agreed to do that. So once she took over, she began cutting costs, selling off a lot of assets that the company didn't need. The company had, like I said, they had just blown a lot of money on stuff that was just irresponsible and sometimes didn't even make any sense. Like one thing that the writer Ben Riggs relates is at one point they spent millions on trying to raise a shipwreck from, I think it was Lake Erie, one of the Great Lakes. They tried to raise a shipwreck from the Great Lakes. Why? I don't know. But TSR spent millions on it. But she started selling things off, like that fleet of automobiles they didn't need. Also sold off Gary's castle, which Gary didn't like. Pretty early on, Gary and Lorraine Williams started having conflicts because again, he didn't like a lot of the changes that she was making. Now, the Bloom brothers, at this point, they were powerless. And with the company, sales were still declining. And with them not really able to affect anything, they approached Gygax and offered to sell him their shares in the company. And Gygax, feeling that they were asking for too much money for the shares, refused to do so. And I'm guessing that later in life, Gygax probably looked back on this moment a lot and really wished he could take it back. Well, that and hiring Lorraine Williams both. So, unable to sell their shares to Gary Gygax, they did the same thing Gary had done. They exercised this option, which allowed them to buy 700 shares, each of them. And then Lorraine Williams also bought up some shares of her own. And then the Bloom brothers sold all their shares to Lorraine Williams, making her the majority shareholder. And as a result, within a few months of arriving at the company, she became the majority shareholder, effectively the owner of the company, named herself president and CEO, and fired Gary Gygax, which was came as quite a shock to him. And and that's bad enough. But the thing was, after he left the company, sorry, let me get that. After he left the company, every time he tried to start up a new RPG game or a new RPG company, TSR would fire off lawsuits at him and basically made it impossible for him to make a living making games. And of course, again, he didn't have much of an education and didn't have a whole lot of marketable skills. So really making games was all he really could do, other than probably just, some sort of manual labor job. And basically sued him into poverty and later in his life. So anyway, she took over the company. And now, if you know anything about the history of TSR and about Lorraine Williams, you know that among fans of the company, she has long been cast as basically a kind of primary villain in TSR's downfall. And I mean, some of it is not without reason. Of course, a lot of this is because Gygax, trashed her at every opportunity. Again, kind of understandably considering what happened. Um, and to Ben Riggs's credit, he did try to give a more balanced view of Lorraine Williams. Now, he notes she refused to be interviewed for his book. And you can kind of understand it. Any book that's going to go over the history of TSR almost inevitably is going to cast her in a bad light. Because the fact of the matter is, it was under her leadership that TSR went bankrupt and wound up being sold off. But he does go to pains to point out that, she wasn't just this kind of cartoonish villain. One thing he points out is one story where there was a game designer that worked for TSR named Bill Connors. Now, Bill Connors had a wife. I don't remember the wife's name, but at some point, Bill Connors' wife had some repressed memories that returned. And these repressed memories involved, without getting too graphic or anything, involved abuse by her father and by other people going back at least to around when she was in kindergarten. And as a result of these returned memories, she developed depression. She developed a lot of mental and emotional issues: depression, anxiety, panic attacks, other things. It got to the point where she was hospitalized for them for a while. Now, after she got out of the hospital, it was clear she was going to require basically full-time care. And Connors offered to resign so that he could take care of his wife. Lorraine Williams let him stay on, and he worked for months basically with full pay, no cut in his pay or anything, even though he was really hardly doing any work for the company, so that he could take care of her. And the author thought that was worthwhile to include, and I agree. I thought that was a good thing to include as well. I'd actually long been planning to do a video about Lorraine Williams where I would kind of compare her to Kathleen Kennedy, because I see a lot of parallels between the two of them. Both of them took over companies that, the company's product was these IPs that were beloved by a certain crowd, basically by the nerd geek crowd, right? And the women in question with these that took these companies over really weren't part of that crowd and really didn't appreciate the crowd that much, didn't appreciate the fan base, and kind of insisted on publishing or producing content that they wanted to make rather than what the customers wanted. In that there are a lot of parallels there. And again, Gygax, when he talked of Lorraine Williams, in his words, Lorraine Williams had contempt for gamers. She really didn't like them, didn't like D&D, but knew that it was valuable and so wanted to control it. I mean, several of the people that Riggs interviewed for the book did point out that she was actually, a lot of them actually preferred working for her rather than working for Gygax and the Bloom brothers, because when Gygax and the Bloom brothers were in charge, again, you had these three people making decisions. So there were often decisions that were contradictory, decisions would be made and then abruptly reversed. And that under Lorraine Williams, for the most part, the company was just much more stable and things were more clear. And a lot of employees actually appreciated that. Now, let's see, what is next here? Okay, so it's true that Williams took control of the company and cut costs and eventually got TSR back to where it was at least in a semblance of financial health. She saved TSR in the short term, but over the long term, she and the people around her in management would make a lot of mistakes, and it would really, in the long term, cost the company dearly. Now, as I noted previously, Lorraine Williams put out a lot of content that she wanted to put out, but that the customers didn't necessarily want. And there's a number of things you could point out as an example, but probably the best example is Buck Rogers. So, as previously mentioned, Lorraine Williams's family owned Buck Rogers. And so, after she took over the company, Lorraine Williams decided that a Buck Rogers role playing game would be a good idea. Give me just a moment here. Okay. So she thought a Buck Rogers role playing game would be a good idea. So in the late 80s, probably around 87 or so, TSR began publishing a Buck Rogers video game. And they didn't just put out like a game, they put out a lot of supporting material. There was a tremendous marketing push by TSR to put this out and a lot of product support of it. The problem was Buck Rogers wasn't selling. It didn't sell. Nobody wanted it. The only people who really wanted this game were Lorraine Williams and her family, because obviously, being the owners of Buck Rogers, whenever TSR used the Buck Rogers character, her family was getting paid. And, you can argue for various reasons why she took control of TSR. Certainly, she claimed it needed to be done to save the company from the mismanagement of Gary Gygax and the Blooms. There's some truth to that, but I think it's also pretty clear that she took control of TSR so that they could use it to produce Buck Rogers related material and enrich her family. And again, this was something where the sales were abysmal, but they just kept pumping out the material anyway. And this would be a mistake that she and the management at TSR would repeat over and over again over time at TSR, and it's one of the things that would eventually lead to the company's downfall. Now, as I mentioned, Lorraine Williams seems to, Gygax described her as having contempt for gamers. Now, from what most of the other people said that were interviewed for this book, I would say it wasn't so much that she had contempt, but she did have a kind of casual sort of disdain, I think. I don't think that she had much use for gamers other than them being a source of revenue. She wasn't part of the gaming community, and so she didn't understand it and didn't really even know anything about D&D, other than it was worth money, other than it was a valuable brand name. And as a result, I think that attitude kind of leaked over not only into the customers, but also into the people at the company who were gaming fans and who were part of that community, particularly the creative people at TSR, the game designers, the writers, the artists, etc. And as a result of this, she and again the other management at TSR kind of had a very they viewed the creatives at TSR that actually produced the role playing games as basically being not of any great importance. To them, it was the brand name that sold, and it wasn't the quality of the products. And certainly it wasn't, you know, the people who were making them weren't that important. And in their view, the creatives, the game designers, the artists, the writers, all that were entirely replaceable. And as a result of that, they lost a lot of talent over the years. People like Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman, who created Dragonlance and Ravenloft, um, Ed Greenwood, who created the Forgotten Realms, R.A. Salvatore, who did a lot of popular Birthright novels. Them and other people wound up being driven away from the company over the years because they felt like they were being treated poorly. And again, they kind of were, because management just didn't see them as being worthwhile in keeping, because, well, who cares? We'll just get someone else to do this stuff. It doesn't matter, because it's the brand name that's important. And that's another thing that really led to the company having problems later on. Now, this sort of casual kind of disregard for their employees also manifested itself in a tendency by Lorraine Williams and management to keep the business side of the company largely opaque to the rest of the employees. People in I think people in management and sales kind of had certainly management knew what was going on. Sales, because they would see all these numbers, they had an idea of what was going on. But the rest of the people, particularly the creatives and game design and all that, really had very little awareness of what was happening with the company. In particular, they were never told like sales numbers. So they had no idea what was selling or wasn't, or what was popular or wasn't, or what was working or wasn't, because they weren't told that sort of information. And this was exacerbated by the fact that Lorraine Williams, when she took over the company, one of the rules she instituted was that she forbid people from playing RPGs on company time. And this, of course, was a bit of a problem, because as a result of this, the game design people couldn't do play testing. I mean, they could, but they couldn't do it at work. They would have to do it on their own time, which, I mean, they were doing it for the company, so you would think it would be something they would get paid for. So again, this sort of exacerbated the issue of the game designers not really knowing what worked and what didn't, what the fans were responding to and what they weren't responding to. Now, in the late 80s, uh, again, because of declining sales and some of the things that they were putting out that weren't succeeding, particularly that Buck Rogers game, the company was starting to have financial problems again. And one thing that was really going well for them, though, was publishing novels. Starting with Dragonlance, TSR had gotten into publishing fiction novels, and it had become actually a very successful and very profitable endeavor for them, because the novels were actually much cheaper to produce than the games. And they had similar sales numbers, so they actually were more profitable than the games were. Because of this success, they also wanted to branch out into other medium. And one of the things they wanted to try was comic books. So in the late 80s, they licensed some of its IPs, like the Forgotten Realms and Dragonlance and other things, to DC Comics to make comic books. And I do remember these at the time, and seeing them. And I would have liked to have bought some of them, but I just didn't have the money. I was already buying as many comics as I could afford, so I really couldn't afford to buy them. But apparently, according to this book, they were pretty solid sellers and were doing fairly well. Now, one thing they weren't publishing was TSR, and by TSR I mean Lorraine Williams, was keen for DC to publish a Buck Rogers comic. And DC was not interested in doing that. And so it seems like out of frustration of not being able to get a Buck Rogers comic made, Lorraine Williams and the management at TSR decided that they would go into comic book publishing themselves. And they founded a comic book company in California called TSR West. Now, up to this point, the stuff that the book relates, I pretty much had already known most of this stuff, again, from reading the book of Dice and Men, which is about the history of D&D and RPGs, and then about also reading a book called Empire of Imagination, which is a biography of Gary Gygax. Those books both cover a lot of this same material. But this is the point where in the book where I started learning things I never knew about. So TSR started up a comic book company, like I say, called TSR West. And Lorraine Williams got her brother, Flint Dill, who was still out in Hollywood, to head up the company. He and a couple of comic pros got the thing up and running. And this wound up being a problem because, of course, DC was publishing TSR comics. And when they saw TSR going into business to publish its own comics, okay, Dega, thanks for stopping by, man. Yeah, feel free to listen later. Okay, so at this point, DC Comics was selling TSR comics, and when they saw TSR going to business for itself, selling comics, they weren't happy about it. Now, TSR tried to blunt this argument by claiming that they weren't making comic books. For each of their comics, what they would do, and another thing I would point out is that for these comics, now they had taken all their existing IPs, well, except Buck Rogers, pretty much, and had sold the rights to them all to DC. So they weren't publishing D&D comics. They weren't publishing Planescape or Spelljammer or Ravenloft comics or whatever. So they had to create a bunch of new IPs from scratch, to make for these comics. Of course, and these were characters nobody had heard of, and they tried to create gaming material to support these characters. Uh, and in order to blunt the argument that they were publishing comics, what they would do is that in each of these comics, they would put some kind of RPG related material in the comics, like say RPG stats for the characters, for example, saying in a game, this is the kind of stats the character would have, or maybe stats for a creature or for some kind of weapon or something, or maybe a map or whatever. And by doing that, they then made the argument that these weren't comic books, these were quote unquote comic modules. DC didn't see it that way, surprisingly. And so DC, they looked at their contract and they weren't certain that they could sue for a breach of contract. So they didn't sue, but what they did do was they ceased publishing all TSR related material. Now, meanwhile, Flint Dill and these other people had gotten the company up and running in LA. The problem was they were going to publish these comic modules, quote unquote, through Random House, which is what they published everything else through. But there's a problem. Random House didn't distribute to comic shops, which of course was where these would need to go to find comic book readers. They were being published in bookstores, and they would go on the shelves next to D&D rule books and adventures and stuff like that. And as a result of this, they weren't really getting into the books of comic book readers who would be likely to purchase them. And instead, they were going into bookstores, and people didn't know what to make of these things. Is it a comic book? Is it a module? What is it? And anyway, the long and short of it is these comic modules were absolute flops. They didn't sell. And within a few months of starting publication, TSR West was shut down. And it wound up being just a complete fiasco and a financial failure for TSR. Now, in the early 90s, sales continued to drop. Now, some in management, I think, accurately pointed out that part of the reason why sales were going down is that they were maybe losing customers because some of the customers who had started out playing D&D in like the late 80s, early 70s, like say me, for instance, were getting older and were maybe aging out to a degree. And I think there was some truth to that. Once I got into college, I didn't play nearly as much. And after I got out of college, I hardly played at all. And some in management identified correctly that they needed to find a way to bring in new customers. They needed to get more young people involved. So they felt they needed to come up with some kind of product, a version of D&D that could be marketed to young kids. And the demographic they were going for was around 8 years old. Like 8 to 10 or 12, somewhere in that range. Now, to do this, they created a game called Dragon Strike. And this was a kind of simplified, it was kind of a combination of an RPG and a board game. And it was kind of a very simplified version of D&D. And it included an instructional VHS tape. Um, and the instructional video was produced by Flint Dill, Lorraine Williams' sister. And this was in 92. Now, with all the material it took to make the game, it was a very expensive product to produce. And initially, it sold well. Like the first few shipments, they sold pretty well, but sales dropped off pretty quickly after that. Now, despite poor sales, TSR kept producing and shipping this game out, even as returns kept coming back and piling up in their warehouse. In 1993, they released a similar product called First Quest. And this thing, instead of a VHS tape, it had an instructional CD-ROM. And again, it was a very expensive product to produce. And again, it really didn't sell well. But again, just like with Dragon Strike, they kept printing this stuff up, producing these games and shipping them out. Even though by this point they knew this stuff was not selling, even though they knew most of it was just going to wind up being returned to them. And in many ways, there's kind of three main reasons for why TSR went bankrupt. One was the mismanagement by Lorraine Williams and the people around her at the top. This is the second reason. And honestly, from a purely financial reason, this is maybe the keystone of the whole mess. This is kind of the cornerstone of why TSR went bankrupt. And it was the contract that TSR had with Random House. So I mentioned earlier that back in the early 80s, TSR was contacted by Random House by this woman named Mildred Marmer, who wanted to start distributing TSR's material. And they wound up forming a contract. And in those early days in the early 80s, it was an absolute boon for TSR. It made them a fortune. But in time, it would kind of become kind of like a poison pill that would bring the company down. So and another thing about this is, again, going back to the point of Lorraine Williams and management keeping the business side largely hidden from the rest of the employees and not telling them anything. The vast majority of the employees knew nothing about this contract with Random House. In fact, Ben Riggs, the author, he said that the vast majority of the employees he talked to about it knew nothing about this contract. They had no clue. And this contract that TSR had with Random House was very unusual and gave bizarrely favorable terms to TSR in the contract. And again, when you consider that Gary Gygax had no formal business training and had no experience making big deals, it's kind of incredible that he was able to swing this deal. I don't know how he did it, but the old Gronyard pulled it off somehow. But anyway, so with a typical distribution deal, according to the book, is like normally, you know, publisher produces product, usually a book, but maybe something else, and sends it to distributor, which, the publisher would be TSR in this case, and the publisher would be, or distributor would be Random House. The distributor would then send the product out to the vendors, the bookstores, who would put it on their shelves. Now, when the book sells, or whatever the product is sells, the vendor would get 40%. The distributor gets 30%. And then the publisher also gets 30%. And that's what the typical arrangement was. But that's not how the contract with Random House worked. TSR's contract, again, it's kind of bizarre. So, and actually, let me read it to you where I've got it here. Yeah, here it is. Okay, so according to the contract, upon completion of a discrete delivery to Random's distribution center of copies of said works, Random House will lend within 7 days of written notice of a loan request by TSR a sum of money up to 27.3% of TSR's suggested retail list price of the copies of the works in that delivery. The unpaid principal balance of each such loan will bear interest until repaid at the Chase Manhattan Bank prime rate in effect on the date the loan is made. Publishers, and this is the one thing that blows me away more than anything. It's this last sentence here. Publishers may repay all or any part of such loans at any time or times without penalty. In other words, not only so this contract with Random House basically required by contract that when they Random House received a shipment of product from TSR, by contract, they had to give a loan of 27% of the value of that shipment to TSR. So if TSR sent them $100,000 worth of product, they then had to give TSR a loan, because these payments were in the form of loans. It wasn't just here's money. It was a loan that was going to be collecting interest that they would need to repay at some point. But again, they could repay it basically at their leisure when they felt like it. And let me see. Now, according to the writer, so why they did this is because TSR wasn't generally, at this point, they weren't working on huge profit margins. And so, they were basically making money off of volume. So most of their money was made as sales piled up and as, the sales from the vendors filtered back to them. Now, they would put a lot of money into the development of a product, and that would often leave them with a shortage of capital, of money to work with and keep, things running smoothly. So this arrangement of them receiving these loans from Random House would give them operating capital to work with comfortably until the profits from the sales of the products began to filter back to the company. And then they could afford to pay the loans back. And this worked fine for many years. According to the book, for much of their time, their return rate was around 20%. But in the late 80s, early 90s, this began to become a problem because their return rates climbed up to 30% as sales began to decline. And as this situation got worse, TSR began to abuse this contract and effectively started using Random House as an income stream. They would ship out all this product that they knew wasn't going to sell, and they knew they wouldn't make any money on, from the vendors, but they knew they'd get a payment from Random House because Random House by contract had to pay them this money. And so they just kept shipping product out the door, hand over fist, even though most of it was coming back and just piling up in their in their warehouse. And another problem that developed was as time went on, they stopped paying these loans back. And so not only were they getting all these loans, which was putting them in debt, these loans were all starting to generate interest, and accrue, and were piling up. And as a result, a very large bubble of debt began to develop at Random House that TSR owed to them. Now, this all came to a head in June of 1995. At this point, TSR owed Random House about $12 million. And at that point, Random House basically confronted them and said, "You need to stop this and pay us our money." And what they wound up doing is they worked out a deal, a payment plan. TSR would, again, and this was in June of 95, TSR would pay down the debt from about 12 million to about 8.2 million by the end of the year. And then in the following year of 96, they would pay the debt down to 1 million. And then, I'm not sure what would happen after that. Part of the deal was that if TSR missed a deadline, if they didn't get the payments paid off, by the deadlines and didn't meet them, then Random House could demand the entire sum to be paid to them immediately. Long story short, TSR was not able to make these payments, and in April of 96, Random House sued TSR. Now, again, I said there were three main reasons why the company went bankrupt. One was the mismanagement. Two was this contract with Random House that TSR abused. And then there's a third reason. And this third reason is a business practice called factoring. Because apparently this thing is, which I'd never heard of before, but apparently it was a practice that Lorraine Williams and their other managers at TSR were very fond of. So let me take a drink here right quick. Okay, so here's how factoring worked. At the beginning of the year, TSR would plan out its release schedule of products for that entire year. Their sales reps in their sales department would then contact vendors, and using the schedule of products, they would generate pre-orders from the vendors. Now, these pre-orders would be bought at a discount, so the vendors could purchase them cheaper if they did a pre-order. And a nice thing for the vendors is they didn't have to actually pay the money. They would sign an agreement to pay the money, but they wouldn't pay it until they actually received the product, which could be many, many months later. TSR would then take these pre-order contracts and then they would sell them to an investment bank. This would then give the company a lot of money at the start of the year. Basically, so they would get agreements from their vendors for to buy a certain amount of product. They would then take these pre-orders to the bank and would sell them to the bank, and the bank would basically give them, I think, pretty much whatever the amount of the orders was, whatever the sales amount that was agreed on was, so that the company could get paid immediately for all these orders. The reason they did this is this would then give them a lot of working capital to plan out their spending out for the rest of the year. And it's also worth noting, so when they did this, they were effectively selling their products at a 12% discount, roughly. The problem was that this would lock in all their spending and their product production and distribution pretty much for the entire year. And it made it difficult for the company to respond to changes in the market and changes in the economy. Like, say, when they put out a product and it wasn't selling, they couldn't necessarily just stop selling it, because of these pre-orders and this factoring thing. They were often locked into selling or to producing and publishing this material even though they knew it wasn't selling. One good example of this that the book comes up with is, so around the beginning of the 90s, TSR produced a copy of the D&D core rules, basically like the DM's guide, monster manual, player's handbook, and all that stuff on a CD-ROM. They struck an agreement with a software store called Babbage's, which was a popular software store at the time. and they were going to put these CD-ROMs into all of Babbage's stores. But before they had finished the CD-ROM and had sent it out, Babbage's went bankrupt. And as a result of this, the company knew that, well, because they're going out of business, basically, anything that goes to these Babbage's stores is going to get marked down to almost nothing, and sold at a fraction of what the suggested real retail price was. But there was nothing they could do about it because, of course, Babbage's had already made all these pre-orders, and therefore they had to send all these software discs out anyway to all these stores, even though they knew that it was either not going to get sold and just be sent back, or if it was sold, it was going to be at a fraction of what the actual worth was. And again, this was a thing that caused them to lose a lot of money over the years. And while we're talking about owing money, and again, let me take a drink of water right quick. Hold on. Okay. So again, debt was becoming a real problem for TSR by the earlier mid 90s. One of the ways this debt manifested itself was they actually wound up failing to make payments to their printer on time, the person that was printing up all their rule books. Now, most of the printing for the company was done through through a printing company owned by a guy named Kennehoff, I believe was the name. But they fell behind on their payments. And eventually got to a point where the printer basically told them, we're not going to pay anything until you pay us the money you owe us. Well, TSR didn't have the money. So what TSR wound up doing as a solution was they basically sold their real estate. They sold the property that the company was based on, their headquarters, to the printer for, I think it was like 6 million or something like that, effectively making their printer their landlord. Now, on top of that, and this is the thing that really would hurt them, they also signed an exclusive agreement with Kennehoff to give Kennehoff the exclusive right to print TSR's material. In other words, if they had a product they wanted printed and published by the contract, they had to go to Kennehoff to get it printed. They could not go to anyone else. This would become a real problem because, again, they fell behind on their payments, got in debt with the printer, and couldn't make the payments. And again, the printer ceased printing and basically said, we're not printing anything until you pay us. TSR couldn't pay them because they didn't have the money. And because of the agreement they had with them, they couldn't find another printer. And this is pretty clear, pretty close to the end of the company because I mean they were just a complete disaster at this point. They were effectively broke, deeply in debt by millions, and they couldn't publish anything because they couldn't print anything. It just crippled the company. And it was at that point, or not long after that, that Wizards of the Coast came around. Of course, this is another thing that really hurt them and helped drive them out of business, which was Wizards of the Coast publishing or producing Magic the Gathering, the collectible card game, which of course became immensely popular in the 90s. And it really drew a lot of business away from TSR and from RPGs in general. And eventually in 1987, Wizards of the Coast bought TSR, and they also assumed TSR's debt at that point, which at that point, TSR's total debt had climbed to about 30 million. And yeah, so Wizards of the Coast bought them, and a few years later, of course, first of all, one of the things they did is they brought back a lot of the people who had been let go over the years, and they produced third edition D&D in the early 2000s, and during that time, of course, created the open gaming license, which has become a big story recently. And like I said, I have a video where I talk about that, and I would direct you to talk about or to look at that video to see what I had to say about that. But the long and the short of it, third edition became very popular, and the open gaming license and third edition really led to a renaissance in RPGs in the early 2000s. And it was wildly successful. And of course, along with Magic the Gathering, Wizard of the Coast was pretty much just printing money. And then around, I think, 2006 or so, Wizards of the Coast was bought by Hasbro, the game producer. And not long after that, they put out fourth edition D&D. And fourth edition didn't go over so well because they made a lot of changes to D&D. And and I've talked about this, I think, in previous live streams already, but they made it less of a role-playing game and more into a kind of combat game. And not only made it a combat game, but they created this combat system that required you to use miniatures. Not just any miniatures, though, required you to use Hasbro's miniatures. And there were also like these other things, like there was a bunch of token sets you could buy that figured into it somehow. I don't know exactly. I never played it. I just read about it. But miniatures had always been part of the game to some degree, but they were always just an option. You didn't have to have them. But with fourth edition, you had to have them. And it was, to me, just such an obvious dig into the customer's wallet. It was just obviously a cash grab, a way to soak the buyers, and it really turned me off. And I didn't buy fourth edition. In fact, I was done with Hasbro at that point. I really didn't buy anything from Wizards of the Coast directly after that. I've bought stuff since then, but it's been mostly stuff that I bought at used bookstores and that sort of thing. And they seemed to learn at the time, because when fourth edition was kind of a flop, they eventually, put out press releases saying they had heard what the fans were saying, and they were going to go back to the drawing board and create a new version of D&D, and they'd make sure that this was one that incorporated what customers wanted. They do a lot of research and surveys and stuff to figure out what the players wanted and give them that. And that would eventually become fifth edition, which became a good seller for them. And particularly, when it was first introduced, I think it was introduced around 2012, somewhere around there. And it sold well, and really over the years, it just grew and grew, and it really became a massive hit. And it was a bit to my surprise because, like I say, at the time when they did fourth edition, I was really pissed, and I just kind of walked away. And it was around that time that the old school Renaissance, or OSR, movement really kind of began to take off. It was there before, but a lot of people, I think, started moving away from D&D, and this is around the time that Pathfinder became really popular. Pathfinder was a kind of basically a D&D knockoff that was published by another company called Paizo, using the open gaming license, and it was growing in popularity. And when fourth edition flopped, a lot of people who didn't like fourth edition migrated over to Pathfinder. And I mean, I don't know the exact sales numbers, but between the release of fourth edition, or after fourth edition flopped, in the years between fourth edition and the release of fifth edition, I would be willing to bet that Pathfinder was probably the top role-playing game. And at that time, in that period, I thought that D&D maybe had kind of had its day. And it was just kind of going to go into decline at that point, because I was looking at the rising popularity of Pathfinder and Dungeon Crawl Classics and these other products that were becoming more popular, and also the popularity of computer games, particularly games on your phone. All those sort of MMORPGs that you could play online and on your phone and all that. And I felt like it was just going to be difficult for D&D to retain its popularity. Of course, what I didn't count on was, in the early 2010s, again, kind of like with the early 2000, there was kind of a surge in fantasy sort of content. You had the Hobbit movies come out, and I know a lot of people, those movies are kind of not viewed well. and is being disappointing. But the fact of the matter is, a ton of people saw those movies and they made a lot of money. Those came out. This was also around the time that Game of Thrones was becoming really popular. And what else was there? And then also another thing I really didn't count on was how D&D was just going to kind of be creeping out into the wider culture. You know, you had lots of shows making reference to D&D. You had Big Bang Theory, they would mention D&D a lot. Rick and Morty, I think, had some D&D related episodes. And maybe the biggest thing that did it was Stranger Things. You know, that I think that was a real hit. And Critical Role was becoming really popular online. And I think because of those things, when 5th edition came out, it really took off. And it grew and grew and actually kind of crested around 2010, 2011 during the pandemic. Uh, 2011, or I'm sorry, 2020, and I think maybe 2021 too, were like the most successful years in the history of D&D. Sales were through the roof, presumably because at that point, you know, people were locked down because of the pandemic. They couldn't go out, couldn't go to restaurants, movies, and whatnot, and were looking for other things to do. And so a lot of people got into D&D that maybe hadn't been before. But then as things began to open up and people could go back out again, a lot of those people began moving away. Now, because they were selling so much during 2010 and 2021, Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast were just printing tons of product to meet this demand. But again, kind of like again with the early 80s, there was a rather sudden drop in sales. And again, it left TSR with a lot of product that was getting returned to them that wasn't selling. And that really hurt their finances. And I talked about that in a previous live stream. But back during the summer, there were reports on how the company, you know, their sales were down, stock was down, they were laying people off. And again, just this past week, Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro announced that the holiday season, the Christmas season, was not good for them. And they're going to be laying off 15,000 people. And then on top of that, you've got this whole mess with the OGL, which has been a real problem for them. And D&D Beyond, which of course is this online portal they want to make everyone go to play D&D. They were shedding subscriptions for that, and that was hurting them. And because people were angry about the OGL, there were a lot of people threatening to boycott that D&D movie, which is coming out in a couple of months. And because of all that, to sum up, I think that's why Wizards of the Coast backtracked on this recent OGL rewrite, you know, this redefinition of the OGL that they were attempting. They basically completely capitulated and gave the customers what they were wanting. And I think it was because, you know, their stock is already in bad shape. It's lost something like, it's down like 35% over the past year. And I think they were looking at, you know, we're going to have layoffs. You know, the next earnings report is probably going to be really bad because of the poor holiday. That's going to drive the stock down. All, you know, and as word gets out about all these subscriptions we're losing to D&D Beyond, that's going to drive the stock down more. And if there's a boycott on our movie, that's going to flop. That'll drive the stock down more. And I think they were just really worried about a potential bloodbath and their stock just going completely into the tank. And that's why they did this reversal to try and get ahead and avoid a mess like that happening. Okay. So I think I'm getting close to about the half-hour mark here. I guess I will probably go ahead and stop here. I want to go ahead and thank everyone who listened to the stream, both during the stream and also during the rewatch. Thank you for showing up. And I will be putting out new videos soon. So look for those. And as always, thanks for watching and have a good night.